On the 2nd of August 1990, at 2 a.m. local time, Iraqi forces invade Kuwait in overwhelming numbers. The emir, Sheikh Jabir Ahmed al-Sabah, and his family escape to Saudi Arabia by helicopter. His brother is killed amid heavy fighting around the palace in Kuwait City.
Iraqi troops have invaded Kuwait and are reported to have taken over the capital, Kuwait City.
On the main Gulf Road, there are either side of the hotel there are Kuwaiti tanks.
The military success of the Iraqi invasion was never in doubt, for the Kuwaiti armed forces were no match for the might of the Iraqi Army, the fourth largest and among the best equipped in the world. But why did the Iraqi leader, Saddam Hussein, decide to invade the small oil-rich sheikhdom on his southern border? Iraq itself has massive oil reserves, second only to those of its huge southern neighbor, Saudi Arabia. And with oil representing over 90% of its exports, the immediate source of conflict with Kuwait lay in the falling price of oil. Kuwait, the Iraqis claimed, was pumping oil at a rate which was directly contributing to the slump in world oil prices. In addition, while Saudi Arabia had agreed to write off the billions of dollars it had loaned Iraq during the 8 years of war with Iran that had ground to an inconclusive halt in 1988, Kuwait refused to write off its loans, also running into billions of dollars. Other long-standing areas of dispute with Kuwait included the shared wealth of the huge Rumaila oil field straddling the border between the two nations, and the sovereignty of the two Kuwaiti islands, Warba and Bubiyan, which effectively control access to Iraq's only major seaport, Qasr. Underlying all of these issues, however, was the desire of Saddam Hussein to enhance his standing in the Arab world. He saw the prospect of swift and certain victory over a small and vulnerable neighbor as a means of demonstrating his domination of the Gulf region. And he banked on the conflicting interests of the Soviet Union and the Western powers, blocking any effective action by the United Nations, as they had done so often in the past.
Instead of staging their coup d'etat and
this proves to be a serious miscalculation. The polarized policies of the Cold War years are no more, and even as Saddam's troops are pouring into Kuwait on day one of the invasion, President Gorbachev joins President Bush in a mutual condemnation of Iraqi aggression. On that same day, August the 2nd, with unprecedented unanimity, the United Nations Security Council passes Resolution 660, condemning the invasion and demanding the withdrawal of all Iraqi forces. The Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher, is at this time on a visit to the USA. She lends her full support to the President's uncompromising response to the Iraqi invasion.
Prime Minister Thatcher and I are looking at it on exactly the same wavelength, concerned about this naked aggression, condemning it, and hoping that a peaceful solution will be found.
The Arab League, too, is swift in its condemnation of Iraq. But the strong leadership necessary for a swift Arab solution to the Iraqi aggression does not materialize. The United States, meanwhile, urges the Saudi and Turkish governments to cut off the pipelines by which Iraq exports the bulk of her oil. Turkey acts quickly, but the Saudi pipeline remains open during the confusion and uncertainty of the next few days. All the time, however, Iraq's hold on Kuwait is being rapidly consolidated by its 100,000-strong invasion force, the spearhead of which are the elite Republican Guard divisions, well equipped with modern armor and artillery, largely supplied, like the Iraqi Air Force, by the Soviet Union. which, through the years of the Cold War, had fostered Iraq as a client state, crucial to its influence in the region. In addition to Soviet-made arms and aircraft, Iraq also possesses over 100 Mirage F-1s, capable of launching Exocet missiles, posing a particular threat to shipping in the Gulf. Iraq's capability to manufacture and deliver chemical weapons had been demonstrated only too clearly by their use against the Kurdish civilian population in the north of the country. And the development by Iraq of long-range variants of the Soviet-made Scud missile raised the possibility of such weapons, armed with chemical warheads, being deployed in Kuwait and threatening the civilian population of Saudi Arabia's northern towns and cities.
I want to see the Arab states join.
August the 5th, 4 days into the invasion. President Bush voices his concern that no positive action had yet been proposed by the Arab nations.
But I am disappointed to find any comment by anyone that apologizes or appears to condone what's taken place.
Mrs. Thatcher, speaking in Aspen, Colorado, underlines the British government's desire for concerted international action against Iraq.
The United Nations members, they must stand up and be counted, because a vital principle is at stake. An aggressor must never be allowed to get his way.
The following day, August the 6th, UN Resolution 661 imposes an embargo on all trade with Iraq, except for medicine and humanitarian food supplies. The only abstentions come from Cuba and the Republic of Yemen. Iraq's immediate response is an announcement that the bulk of its oil exports will henceforth be routed via the pipeline crossing Saudi Arabia, in a further effort to intimidate King Fahd. Meanwhile, U.S. Defense Secretary Richard Cheney flies into Riyadh for urgent talks with the king. 2 days later, on August the 8th, as Iraq declares its annexation of Kuwait, the first U.S. troops and aircraft begin arriving on Saudi soil. 4,000 men of the 82nd Airborne Division, and with them F-15 long-range strike aircraft, flying non-stop from their bases in the United States, refueling in flight from tanker aircraft based in Spain and Sicily.
America does not seek conflict, nor do we seek to chart the destiny of other nations. But America will stand by her friends. The mission of our troops is wholly defensive. Hopefully, they will not be needed long. They will not initiate hostilities, but they will defend themselves, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and other friends in the Persian Gulf.
Planning for the possible deployment of British troops in Saudi Arabia is centered on the headquarters of the 1st British Corps in BAOR.
After I talked to the Commander-in-Chief, we in Corps Headquarters did look very carefully to see what we had available in the 1st British Corps at that time. We did a stock check. And then later, at the 7th of August, again after I talked to the Commander-in-Chief, within Corps Headquarters only, we looked at the implications of sending first an armoured division, secondly an armoured division minus, an armoured division consisting of 2 brigades, and also of an armoured brigade. However, we still didn't have any clear direction about what was required. We again, having looked at those 3 options, looked at a number of others, for instance, a medium reconnaissance brigade, an artillery brigade, an aviation regiment, so that if we were going to be suddenly asked to send something, we knew exactly what we could and couldn't do.
In fact, when it comes, the British government's initial response stops short of sending ground troops.
I've given instructions today for 1 squadron of Tornado air defense fighters to move shortly to assist with the air defense of Saudi Arabia. This squadron is already in Cyprus, and together with its necessary air transport and tanker support, we'll move forward to Saudi Arabia as soon as possible.
Within 24 hours, tactical communications are established in Riyadh for the British contribution to the defense of Saudi Arabia, codenamed Operation Granby. Operating from Headquarters RAF Strike Command at High Wycombe, Air Chief Marshal Sir Patrick Hine is appointed UK Joint Commander in overall command of all British forces sent to the Gulf area. His commanders in the region: Commodore Paul Haddocks, Senior Naval Officer Middle East, and Air Vice Marshal Sandy Wilson, Commander British Forces Arabian Peninsula.
Yes, on arrival at Dhahran, where I arrived first of all, there was an immense amount of activity. I mean, this was the 12th of August, 2 days after the Americans have arrived. Our own contribution of a Tornado F-3 squadron had arrived the day before. And this enormous base, which is difficult for many people to grasp unless they've seen Saudi Arabian bases. But a general Air Force airfield, we could fit 7 RAF airfields into this sort of size of airfield we had there. Absolutely covered with aeroplanes. I think there was something like 14 wide-bodied aircraft of the American Air Force already in there unloading, Hercules, enormous activity. And already the Americans were mounting combat air patrols. When I moved on to Riyadh, where I set up my headquarters with the American forces, matters were a little cooler. But I think there was some considerable confusion amongst the Saudis, who were really bewildered with what was going on and quite amazed at the pace of the American build-up. And, of course, our own swift response had taken them quite by surprise, I think.
When I took up my command, the forces in the Gulf were the Armilla Patrol. And the Armilla Patrol's function for many years had been to provide direct support to UK-flagged merchant shipping operating in the Gulf. And in the very initial days of the crisis, that did remain my main concern, to ensure that British shipping within the Gulf area was going to be safe. And we therefore gave both close and distant support to UK flag shipping within the Gulf. As the UN resolutions to do with the embargo began to be formulated, our focus started to change from protection of shipping to enforcement of the embargo. And we, in conjunction with our allied navies, set up a mechanism of challenge, identification, and board and search, if required, which had as its concept a sort of layered defense. And we had shipping outside the Gulf and at various choke points coming through the Gulf, so that any ship coming in would find itself identified as early as possible. A 100,000-ton tanker determined to go somewhere is a very hard beast to stop. So we did have a real concern there as to how we were going to do that. And the earlier we identified the likely blockade runners and got people on board them to inspect them, the better. And our aim for inward-bound ships was always to try to do this in the Gulf of Oman, where there was lots of sea room, and for outward-bound ships from Iraq, to identify them as early as possible before they had got very far down the Gulf itself.
Crucial to the political credibility of the coalition now rapidly taking shape is the decision on August the 10th at the Arab League summit in Cairo, in which 12 member states, including both Egypt and Syria, vote to send military forces in support of Saudi Arabia. Meanwhile, just 2 hours after their arrival at Dhahran from Cyprus on the 11th of August, RAF Tornadoes are participating in combat air patrols with the United States Air Force. And within a further 48 hours, a squadron of ground attack Jaguars with VC-10K tanker support is operational at Thumrait Air Base in Oman.
We went out there in a very uncertain situation, and we really didn't know whether we'd be going to war the next day. So we most important that we had to put up that air defense guard And of course it was backed up under the Saudi ground environment, the ground radars and everything else. But also, of course, AWACS was there 24 hours a day. I was responsible for negotiating firstly with the Americans and then with the Saudis to come up with a command and control arrangement that would stand the test, obviously, of both the lead-in to any war and, of course, war itself. And we quite clearly identified the benefits of going under American command because of our common training, common equipment and everything else. And basically it was an American show and it was American infrastructure and so on. Because it was desperately important during this stage that we didn't have an accidental shooting down of Iraqi aircraft. That, of course, could precipitate a conflict. For years, we've been dealing with a European enemy that operated very discreet Soviet-type aircraft. Here, we are operating against an enemy that had both French and Western and other aircraft as well as Soviet. So we had a tremendous problem in this identification area. But happily, we didn't shoot any aircraft down.
Throughout August, the coalition forces steadily grow and take on a truly multinational character. In terms of manpower and equipment, however, it is the military might of the United States that underwrites the credibility of Operation Desert Shield. By the third week of August, American ground forces are arriving in Saudi Arabia at the rate of 1,000 per day. The build-up of coalition forces is given added momentum by continuing Iraqi intransigence. On August the 15th, Saddam Hussein sues for peace with Iran, acceding to all Iranian claims arising out of the enormously costly and inconclusive 8-year Iran-Iraq war, thus reducing his military commitment on his eastern border. Fears for the safety of Western nationals held in Kuwait and Iraq deepen as the Iraqi regime announces its human shield policy of dispersing foreigners to key military and industrial sites throughout Iraq.
But when Saddam Hussein specifically offers to trade the freedom of those citizens of many nations he holds against their will in return for concessions, there can be little doubt that whatever these innocent people are called, they are in fact hostages.
Saddam Hussein is now trying, in his tactics, to hide behind Western women and children and use them as human shields and use them as part of his negotiations. We do not enter into such negotiations. These people are entitled to certain fundamental human rights which are being totally flouted to the repugnance of the whole of the civilized world.
On August the 22nd, China deals a body blow to any last hope that Saddam Hussein might have of a split in world opinion by announcing that there would be no Chinese veto of any Security Council resolution approving military action. The isolation of Iraq becomes virtually complete when, on August the 24th, President Rafsanjani of Iran says he has no objection to Iraq being forcibly ejected from Kuwait. August the 25th. UN Resolution 665 formally endorses the use of measures commensurate with the enforcement of the trade embargo against Iraq. The activity of the occupying Iraqi forces is carefully monitored. By late August, the construction of extensive fortifications and bunkers along the entire length of the border between Kuwait and Saudi Arabia is clearly visible, and the prospect of a prolonged military standoff, punctuated by inconclusive peace talks while sanctions take their gradual toll on the Iraqi economy, begins to emerge as a distinct possibility. September begins with the welcome departure from Iraq of 200 British women and children held there as part of Saddam's human shield policy.
The House will be familiar with
September the 6th, Parliament is recalled from its summer recess to debate the crisis in the Gulf.
We have deployed a squadron of Tornado F-3 air defense aircraft, a squadron of Tornado ground attack aircraft, and a squadron of Jaguar aircraft for ground support. They're stationed in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Oman. They are backed up by VC-10 tanker aircraft and Nimrod maritime patrol aircraft. One Royal Navy destroyer and 2 frigates are in the Gulf. A second destroyer is on its way, as are 3 mine clearance vessels. There are also a number of support ships in attendance. A limited number of ground forces are deployed to defend airfields and provide security generally. This is already a valuable contribution to the defense of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, but we believe some additional forces will be needed, and their composition is under consideration.
When we were told we would send a brigade, it wasn't difficult to choose 7th Armoured Brigade. They weren't chosen, as some people suggested, because they were the famous desert rats. They were chosen because they were the right people in the right place at the right time. They had the best equipment. They had Challenger. They had Warrior. They were well led. They had also, nearly all of them, been able to go to Canada during the summer, so they were in a high state of training. So I didn't find it at all difficult to point towards 7th Armoured Brigade and say that those are the people who should go.
Training in BAOR was a problem because we had a period of about 7 to 10 days when we had the equipment, but thereafter we had a period of 3 weeks while the equipment was on the seas when we could only really carry out individual training. So we had almost a reverse cycle where we had low-level collective training, typically crew training or crew firing of the weapon systems, and platoon and maybe company level activities. Then the equipment was put on ships. Then we went into an individual cycle where people brushed up their individual skills, weapon firing, NBC, all of those sort of things.
We had to take a lot of extra people into all our regiments to bring them up to the war establishment. I mean, 40 Field had some 500 on peace establishment, went up to 1,000, for instance, and the Staffords took over 100 men in from various different battalions throughout Germany and elsewhere. And of course, they all came at a different level of training, which did pose us with problems. But the strength of the regimental system played a part here. And if you got, for instance, a Grenadier Guardsman joining the Staffords, he would be absolutely determined that he wasn't going to let the Staffords down. Equally, at the same time, he wasn't going to let the Grenadier Guards down. So he worked exceptionally hard to make certain that his level was exactly the same as standard.
We were determined and were directed only to send the best equipment, Challenger and Warrior, and it wasn't all in the right place. So we had to do a certain amount of moving equipment around. This meant robbing Peter to pay Paul. We had to take spares away, and unfortunately, we were very short of spares, and the reliability of some of our equipment, particularly Challenger, was very worrying. But we did get there, but there was a big price to pay.
Al Jubail, with its modern port and airport facilities, already being extensively used by the US Marine Corps for the deployment of its forces to defend the Saudi border area with Kuwait, is also the favoured port of entry for the 7th Armoured Brigade. But did it have the capacity to accommodate a British Armoured Brigade group as well as the US Marines?
The initial recce was not a tactical recce, it was an operational recce, and I and the team were out there to make certain that there was ports and airfields that were capable of taking us, and also that was the infrastructure there to look after what at that stage was likely to be 8,000 men, but of course rose later to some 12,000 men. And it was a fascinating period because as soon as you arrived, you realized that the Americans were up and running and were there, and there was a vast amount of equipment already in the ports and airfields, which was going to actually make our entry quite difficult. And then we had to find out whether we could feed 8,000 men and water and so on and so forth. And you must remember, too, that temperatures when our soldiers were going to arrive was going to be up into the 120 degrees, and that was going to be difficult, too, and how are we going to cope with that?
As the intensive training program continues in BAOR, the brigade equipment is transported to Bremerhaven, from where the first ships depart for the Gulf on September the 28th, bound for Al Jubail. The deployment of 7 Armoured Brigade effectively doubles the number of British personnel committed to the multinational force. It was appropriate, therefore, that a new post be created, that of British Forces Commander, Middle East, commanding the units of all services in the Gulf, and reporting to the UK Joint Commander at High Wycombe. On October the 1st, the appointment of Lieutenant General Sir Peter de la Billière is announced.
We were intent at that stage to protect Saudi territory from any further aggression by Iraq. And therefore, when they came out, they came under command of the Marines on the East Coast, because that was, first of all, probably the area that was most threatened by the Iraqis, because their logistics were suited to the lengths of the LFC in that particular area, and because they had empathy with the Marines, which they very quickly built up, and the Marines were, in American terms at that stage, the most significant force in theatre, although later that was not to be the case. So the significance really was that we were making a major ground contribution to the defence of Saudi Arabia, and it enabled us to break in to the coalition complexities in a fairly gentle way. The other vital and most important change that this brought about was that for the first time we were involved in operations involving the Air Force, the Navy and the Army, and that of course meant that the Joint Tri-Service Headquarters had to come out, and it was therefore for that reason that I eventually came out in my appointment as British Forces Commander, Middle East.
As General de la Billière takes command and troops of 7 Brigade begin departing for the Gulf, the UN Security Council agrees Resolution 670, imposing an air embargo on Iraq. This enables further international action to be taken to deny Iraq the means to sidestep UN sanctions by importing spare parts and other strategic supplies by air. The latest in a growing list of Security Council resolutions demonstrating the resolve of the international community not to allow Iraqi aggression to succeed.
The planning in Saudi Arabia in those early days was really under Saudi overall control, but American detailed guidance. I think that would be the right way to put it. And the plans were very simple. They were to defend Saudi Arabia. There were no complexities about how we were going to carry out an attack, and not very much about combining the plans of the Navy, the Air Force and the Army at that stage, because we were waiting for an initiative from the Iraqis and not taking the initiative ourselves. So it was purely straightforward, simple, defensive operation. And this was brought about by me being involved with Norman Schwarzkopf in daily discussions and briefings. As far as the RAF was concerned, they were working, as is normal in air operations, under the central control of the Americans, who were the largest users Air Force-wise, and their operations were coordinated by them. And as far as the Navy is concerned, at that stage, not very much changed.
We and the American Navy in the Gulf had for a long time had a close working relationship, but in no time during my tenure of office was I under any American command. We had very close liaison with the Americans, and I offered my forces to the Americans in support of various board and search operations to do with the embargo. But this was done by mutual agreement and not by any delegation of authority. And we had good relations too with the small but quite potent Gulf navies. But we were aware that other navies were on their way. The French were there almost as soon as we were. The Canadians, the Australians, the Dutch, they were all coming, and we heard rumblings that from further afield, such as Argentina, naval forces were coming as well. So getting those forces to present a cohesive and united front, outwardly at least, was very important. And was an important part of our political resolve in those early days.
In the air, Saudi and American AWACS aircraft monitor the activities of the Iraqi Air Force around the clock, while the coalition air forces mount continuous combat air patrols to counter the ever-present threat of an Iraqi airstrike.
We, of course, knew that he had a capable air force. He had some good aircraft from Soviet MiG-29s and Mirages. He didn't have a lot in that category, but nevertheless he had a lot of other aircraft that were very capable. And we didn't know, of course, what his intentions were. Had he decided that he wished to move into Saudi Arabia, he had at his disposal an air force that would cause us considerable difficulty. I don't think it was until about the middle of September that we felt we had the level of force to cope with any contingency. At that time, though, we were watching his flying on a daily basis. He was not doing a great deal of flying. He was not doing much night flying. He was not doing a lot of large formation flying, the sort of thing you'd need to do if you were going to pose a serious threat to one of the Saudi airfields and so on. But my perception changed because as he saw the build-up of the coalition forces, he decided to change his tactics. And we did start to see an increase in night flying. We did see some aircraft moving in the sort of profiles that would indicate that they could attack Saudi airfields and so on. And I think it was right that we never underestimated the threat. I don't think any of us guessed at that stage that he wouldn't come out and fight on the day.
By mid-October, the total numbers of ships, combat aircraft, tanks and manpower committed by the coalition partners have grown very significantly. In manpower terms, the UK contribution, including the 7th Armoured Brigade Group, totals 12,000, while US forces now number in excess of 170,000. The chief architects of the military planning which underpins this rapid and continuing build-up of military force are General Colin Powell, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and General Norman Schwarzkopf, Commanding General Central Command and now Commander U.S. Forces in the Gulf.
My gut's told me the same thing ever since I've been here, and that's we got a big job to do, and every night when I go to bed at night, I think what I'm going to do the next morning when I get up, and every morning when I get up, I think what I'm going to do every hour after that. You know, this is a big enterprise over here and a lot of responsibility, and I take it very, very seriously, and frankly, half the night I think about it too.
General Schwarzkopf's mission has two main objectives. First, to ensure that Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states are secure from the threat of further Iraqi aggression, and second, to demonstrate that the member nations of the coalition are in deadly earnest in support of UN Resolution 660 to the effect that Iraq must withdraw from Kuwait unconditionally.
The United Nations moved swiftly and decisively, condemning Iraqi aggression, demanding an immediate and unconditional withdrawal of Iraqi forces from Kuwaiti soil. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council spoke with one voice, and at the request of Saudi Arabia, we, the United States, moved quickly to put into effect the defense plans we at Central Command had prepared to enable us to respond to just such a crisis. The British were right there with us, shoulder to shoulder. Like us, you had warships already there on station in the Gulf. You sent aircraft to help defend Saudi airspace, and when we wanted the support of your ground troops, they too were sent.
Early in October, the Royal Naval presence in the Gulf is augmented by the arrival of 3 Hunt-class mine countermeasure vessels, urgently required to combat the ever-present threat from Iraqi mines. This is a vital part of the protection provided by the Royal Navy to the steady flow of ships into and out of Al Jubail that are henceforth to constitute Britain's sea tail.
With 4 frigates, albeit with some more on the way, I was clearly hard pushed in terms of my own national forces to do this, and we looked after their safety through that transit of the Red Sea, really through distant support and through the cooperation with our allies. The Americans had major naval forces in the Red Sea itself. They were well aware, through us, of the daily movements of our shipping and kept a weather eye open for us. As they came into the Gulf, clearly we were able to do something more direct in their support, and indeed we provided both distant and close support to those ships as they came up. We had also been very conscious of the threat from mines once more to the approaches to Al Jubail, where they were going to offload, and we had arranged to mount a minesweeping operation to secure the approaches to Al Jubail, and this was completed just before the first ships arrived.
When we arrived in Jubail, clearly time was not on our side. We were under pressure to set up the logistic base quickly because the operational picture was fairly unclear, and we had a great deal of stock and equipment to receive, marry up and send out into the desert. The port operators were busy unloading ships. 10 Regiment RCT were moving stocks away from the docks and putting them into the force maintenance area, supply areas, some of which were 20 kilometres out into the desert. 33 Field Hospital was setting up our field hospital in the Jubail area, and indeed 24 Field Ambulance, my own field ambulance in the force maintenance area, was providing medical cover for the thousands of soldiers who were waiting to deploy out into the desert at this stage.
On arrival in Al Jubail, I found myself with a lot of eager soldiers, nowhere to live and operate from, and initially no equipment to carry out any tasks. The biggest problem for us on arrival in Al Jubail was to assess the many tasks we'd been given, allocate manpower and indeed vehicles as they began to arrive across the jetty. I had been sent there initially to receive my vehicles and then assist with the outload of the ships coming into the port, but I was also given the responsibility of running reception, the reception of 7 Brigade group through the port of Al Jubail. To my surprise, also, we were given the responsibility to run the 2,000-man tented camp, which eventually became affectionately known as Baldrick Lines. That in itself was a massive task. The tented camp wasn't completed by the time we got there. There was no infrastructure, no facilities, and therefore I had to detach a large element of the regiment, the quartermaster's department essentially, to running the tented camp and setting it up for 2,000 men. All the while, of course, equipment was arriving on the jetty. 7 Brigade were arriving day and night into the sheds, and we had all that to cope with. As my vehicles arrived, we organised them into sections, troops and squadrons, and began the task of moving equipment away from the dockside.
There's a feeling of excitement buzzing around, which I'm sure you can feel. The boys in the sheds woke up this morning with a purpose, going to get the kit unloaded, and really looking forward to getting out into the desert and working alongside the American Marines. It's very exciting.
We took over a dockside warehouse, which was just a huge building about the size of a football field, and we set up in there to carry out a modification program on the Challenger tanks. We were also doing some modification work on the Warriors, but we did those outside on the quayside itself. There was a problem with the air filtration system of the Challenger tanks, which was known about in Germany, but because the conditions were such, it wasn't dusty and sandy, except on Saltau, we could get away with it, and there was no urgency for the modifications to be fitted. In the desert, sand would become a real problem, and therefore it was vital that that modification was fitted. We were under great pressure. We had to do a squadron a day. Initially, each tank took us 18 hours, and therefore to produce 16 or 17 tanks, which we were doing, we were under great time pressure. We started at 7 in the morning, and the first day we'd actually finished at about 3 in the morning, ready for the next lot to come in at 7 that same morning.
The setting up of the Jabeur range, where we had chosen to do our fire manoeuvre, to make certain, first of all, the guns were firing correctly, and then to do the absolutely essential training that was going to get us ready for war, was a very complicated business. I got heavily involved in this because when you're dealing with the Emir of Al Jubail, for instance, it's rarely a commander has got to go and see him. And so the first thing that was necessary was to get the Emir's permission to move Bedouin settlements from off the area that we've been given to do this manoeuvring in. And he was extremely cooperative. Then, with his staff, we sent our own staff out to ask the Bedouins to move, and then to move their camel herds off what was clearly prime camel grazing area. Now, that, of course, wasn't the end of it, because we then had to mark and survey the entire range in, which was a complicated performance. But having marked it, we then had to patrol the borders each day before we fired. But again, once you've done that, and remembering that there were patrolling aircraft overhead the whole time, there were hundreds of sorties going up towards the Kuwaiti border from Dhahran and Al Jubail, that airspace above the range had to be cleared.
We were in opposition to the Americans in a way at that stage, because they were setting up really what I would call just straightforward gallery-type ranges for tanks and artillery, at which they merely fired their weapons. We wanted a very different approach. We wanted a live firing range with movement up to squadron, indeed two-squadron level. So we had a bit of a problem getting that idea over to the Americans to get our range cleared. But we did manage it eventually, and our first round went down the range at about 8:30 on the 2nd of November.
The problem that we faced in getting a brigade ready for war was, how do you get away from the normal safety regulations that exist, say, in batters, and persuade them that the manoeuvre is free and open to them, and they can fire under war-type conditions while in training, if you like. And for the first time, we realised that it might be possible that we'd kill people during training once we reduced the safety levels. Now, that may seem a very obvious comment when you're preparing for war, but until you're actually put into that position, it doesn't really come home to you. And, of course, General Peter de la Billière was quite clear as to how we had to go about it, and made my job much easier as a result by, you know, backing me up and making it quite clear that he understood about the reduction of safety standards as well.
We were extremely well trained because of batters, so we had a good base to start on. Though, of course, even when we got out to the desert, there were still new faces amongst us, and I had 2 new company commanders. But the first bit of live firing we did was really up to company squadron group level and no higher. On the lower side of life, so to speak, that we did at platoon level, platoon assaulting of trenches, and then we gradually moved up to the company squadron group attack using all our weapon systems. So we gradually brought it up. And a lot of this was education, because some of our weapon systems were not functioning as well as perhaps we'd like in the desert. So there's an educational process in the live firing package that we did initially.
The straightforward tank firing itself, wonderful to have an open piece of desert with marked out by ourselves, complete freedom to fire within that at such targetry as could be arranged. And then when the fire and manoeuvre side of life came on, we had the engineers there with us, some obstacles to cross, the artillery live fire being incorporated into our exercise, and of course the infantry mortars as well. That was quite exciting. Many of the peacetime safety restrictions and distances were dramatically reduced, and so we had bigger bangs much closer to us, and of course for once we had a real sense of purpose. There was an enemy we'd known about, we'd read about, we could hear about on the radios, and realism was actually very easy to achieve. And of course we actually had the all-arms aspect ever present with us, rather than having to try and arrange it rather artificially in Germany.
Well, the Irish Reserves were in an interesting position, because having just returned from England in a split role in the UK, we had never been to the Great Batters. In fact, we had only done one short exercise as a regiment on Saltire, and we hadn't had infantry on that either. So in terms of training as a regiment or as a combined arms group, we had done very little. We had plenty of enthusiasm, I can tell you that. And of course our spell on the ranges immediately prior to going, was very successful.
We deployed into the desert, and our priority was to really finish off the individual training that had been conducted in BAOR. Our emphasis had been on individual training in Germany, because it was felt that if we could perfect all those individual skills, such as tank gunnery, firing 94mm law, then we had some really good building blocks on which to work up the rest of the training. There were some things that we couldn't do, like firing 50 caliber machine guns, which we then possessed, but we didn't have the ammunition or the range space. But that was soon overcome when we got to Al Jubail and were able to train up with the US Marines.
The early days were very crucial to us in particular, having not done a lot before. And I issued a very short directive, which was that we had to learn to live and fight in the desert by the middle of November. We lived under a pretty strict routine, although we were a long way from the enemy at that stage. But it was important to start training for war right away, and it was no longer just training. We had to learn how to use and maintain our equipment very quickly. There'd been a lot of criticism about the equipment before we went. We wanted to prove them wrong. We had to learn how to maneuver in what was a much bigger space than we'd ever maneuvered in before. And we had to learn how to do it in combination with the infantry and with the artillery. And therefore, the first 3 weeks of training was crucial. It was very, very intense. A lot of it done at night because of the heat. But by the end of it, I reckoned that we could have gone to war.
The culmination of the firing on Jubail Range was an exercise called Exercise Feroza Shah, which took in an armoured infantry company, an armoured squadron, guns and mortars, all firing us in. It took a certain amount of planning, but as we crossed the start line, when we put the very first company and squadron in, I realised at the time that we just hadn't prepared for the exercise as they would prepare for such an exercise at Battus. And all the recce that we must assume the safety staff participate in. We had had one recce and had seen the ground that once only. We crossed the start line, everything was firing, the warriors were firing us in, the tanks were firing us in, and the guns were coming down, and about 300 metres short of the objective, you realise that it was all still firing. Even the guns were firing on the objective, and I, as the principal safety man, had my head out of the turret, and I didn't think anything was going to stop firing. I felt right at that moment, and with the chap sitting in the turret next to me, that we had completely lost control. But it was at that moment when I really felt I ought to stop the whole thing, that you realise that the state of the training of the soldiers was so good that they were controlling themselves. And the safety staff were there to act to stop any horrendous safety error, but that we could allow the margin to go down in this training for war. To see all that firing going on, to see those guns firing infantry right onto the objective and then lifting, was a sobering experience.
And I think in the first period of firing, we wounded 5 people, mostly through grenade firing. But the message was rammed home that you were responsible for your own safety. That is a message that we've got to work on, I think, for the future as well. And so once that had happened, we then did this week's firing period with extremely fluid movement. And I felt very confident at the end with the level of knowledge, because of Battus in 1990, that we were ready for war by the 16th of November.
After consultation with King Fahd and our other allies, I have today directed the Secretary of Defense to increase the size of U.S. forces committed to Desert Shield to ensure that the coalition has an adequate offensive military option should that be necessary to achieve our common goals.
The increase in ground forces announced by President Bush is by any definition a very substantial one. It includes 2 further armoured divisions, an armoured brigade, and 2 mechanized divisions. In addition, another Marine Corps amphibious group, 3 U.S. Navy carrier battle groups, another battleship, and yet more combat and support aircraft are to be sent to the Gulf. So, By the time the Defense Secretary, Mr. Tom King, visits 7 Armored Brigade to witness the completion of their fire and maneuver exercise, the decision has been taken to give the coalition forces the capability to plan for offensive action.
It is now 3.5 months since Iraq invaded Kuwait and has continued to defy the United Nations demand to withdraw. Sanctions have left Iraq increasingly isolated. The Royal Navy has played an important part in this embargo. But Saddam Hussein shows no sign yet of complying with UN resolutions. It remains the government's firm objective to resolve this crisis as soon as possible and by peaceful means. The government has today decided to deploy an extra brigade, a divisional headquarters and supporting arms. They will join 7 Armoured Brigade in Saudi Arabia to form the 1st Armoured Division.